In November 1943, a radio operator was logging routine traffic on a convoy off the North African coast when a transport astern of him was hit by something that did not exist. What went into that ship would overturn everything Allied planners believed about what was flying against them. The transport was carrying American troops from the Mediterranean toward the Far East. She was hit in the port side, the explosion went through her, and she sank within about 90 minutes in a rising sea with poor visibility and boats that would not launch. 1,015 American servicemen died. It is the largest single loss of United States troops at sea from enemy action in the history of the country, and it is larger than the loss on any American warship in that war. For a long time, the accepted account of air attack on shipping went like this. An aircraft attacks a ship by dropping a bomb or launching a torpedo, both of which require the aircraft to come in close, low, and straight, which is why ships carry anti-aircraft guns and why the defense of a convoy is a matter of putting enough fire into the approach path. Every countermeasure in the fleet was built on that geometry, but here is what came off the aircraft that day. The escorts had gunnery solutions, trained crews, and the correct doctrine. Yet somehow what struck the transport had been released from a bomber several miles away and well outside gun range, and had then flown to the ship under control, steered by an operator in the aircraft, watching a flare in its tail and working a joystick that sent commands by radio. It was a guided missile, and it was the first war in which one had ever hit anything. Building it required an airframe with control surfaces, a rocket motor, a radio receiver tuned to a channel the aircraft could transmit on, and a man in the aircraft who could fly two things at once. Someone designed the guidance and tested it over a range. Someone trained the operators to fly two things at once, which nobody had ever had to do before. Someone in a bomber several miles out watched a flare in the tail of a falling object and moved a stick and put a warhead into a ship full of men he could not see and would never see. Then the loss was classified. The survivors were instructed not to discuss what had sunk the ship, because the weapon was the secret rather than the sinking, and the families were told their sons had been lost at sea without a cause. The instruction was never formally lifted. Survivors held reunions from the 1970s, campaigned for recognition, and a memorial was dedicated in 1996, more than 50 years afterward. Congress formally acknowledged the loss in 2000. What makes this particularly unsettling is not the secrecy. It is which fact was protected. The men were expendable to the record, and the technology was not, and the decision was correct in 1943, because knowing that the Allies knew what the weapon was would have told the other side to change it. 1,000 deaths were filed without a cause in order to protect a fact about a radio channel. The truly disturbing aspect isn't this ship. It's what a wartime classification does afterward. An order given for a reason, with an obvious end date, does not expire on that date. It has to be canceled by somebody, and nobody is assigned to cancel it, and the men who were told stayed, told for the rest of their lives. Wartime restrictions were issued in enormous numbers, for good reasons, with the expiry left implicit, and the men bound by them mostly died bound. What else was never canceled? We have a memorial and a congressional resolution. We have no idea how many families were ever told what happened. The wreck is in deep water off the Algerian coast and has never been surveyed, and the men are still on the casualty lists without a cause. Number 2. The Mole. In the summer of 1940, a naval officer was compiling embarkation returns from an evacuated French port when the arithmetic stopped matching what the country had been told. What those returns showed would overturn everything Britain believed about how its own army came home. For a long time, the accepted account of that evacuation went like this. The army was trapped against the sea, the Royal Navy could not reach it, and the country sent its own small boats, an amateur fleet crossing the channel to fetch its soldiers home, a dozen at a time. It is one of the founding stories of the country, and it is told in those terms in schools, in films, and in political speeches. 338,000 men were lifted off that coast in 9 days. The small boats were real. Around 700 of them crossed. Yachts, launches, fishing smacks, and pleasure cruisers, crewed in many cases by their owners. But here is what the returns record. The beaches were shallow and shelving, which meant no large ship could come alongside, and the little boats were real and were there. Yet somehow, roughly 2/3 of the men who came home did not leave from the beach at all. They walked out along a stone breakwater in the harbor, a mole about a mile long and wide enough for 4 men abreast, and boarded destroyers and passenger ferries tied alongside it, in a lift that was organized, queued, and continuous, and the ships that carried them were naval vessels and requisitioned transports rather than private boats. The small craft that crossed were used mainly to ferry men from the sand out to the larger ships lying offshore, which is essential work and is not the work the story describes. Someone had the idea of using a breakwater as a pier, which nobody had considered before that week because a mole is a wall and is not built to take a ship alongside. Someone stood at the end of it for 6 days directing traffic under bombing, sending men down one side and ships up the other. Someone worked out how many a destroyer could take and how fast it could be turned round. Someone took a pleasure launch across the channel and did exactly what the story says, and there were about 700 of them. Then the story set. A broadcast in the week after the evacuation put the little ships at the center of it. The phrase entered the language within days, and the version fixed before any of the returns were compiled. Nothing was suppressed. The numbers were published, the naval histories described the mole, and the official account has never said anything else. What makes this particularly troubling is not the myth. It is that the two versions serve different purposes, and only one of them is a story. A queue of men filing onto a destroyer in an orderly lift organized by the Royal Navy is what happened, and it is not narratable. Amateur sailors crossing a sea to fetch their army home is narratable, and it is also true, and it accounts for a fraction of the number. The truly disturbing aspect isn't this evacuation. It's what a founding story does to the record underneath it. The documents were never closed and nobody had to lie. A version formed in the first week. It did what the country needed, and every subsequent account was written into a shape that already existed, with the returns available the whole time to anybody who asked for them. Every country has 3 or 4 of these, and they are the events that carry what the country believes about itself, which means the shape is load-bearing and the record underneath it is not consulted. What is currently in a shape? We have the Embarkation returns. We have no idea how many people have read them. The mole is still there, repaired, working as part of the harbor, and the beach is a beach. Number 3. The Laconia. In September 1942, a submarine crew were surfacing after a routine sinking in the South Atlantic when the water around them filled with people who should not have been aboard. What the commander did next would overturn everything both navies believed about the rules they were fighting under. The ship he had sunk was a British liner in military service. What he had not known was that she was carrying about 1,800 Italian prisoners of war in her holds, together with Polish guards, British service personnel, and civilians, including women and children. He surfaced into the wreckage, began taking survivors aboard, radioed his own command, and then broadcast in clear English on an international frequency that he would not attack any ship coming to assist, and gave his position. 2 more submarines joined him. Vichy French warships were dispatched. He proceeded on the surface with survivors on deck and in the hull and 4 lifeboats under tow, flying a large Red Cross flag across the gun platform. For a long time, the accepted account of submarine warfare went like this. It was the branch that abandoned the old rules first. The convention had been that a warship stopping a merchant vessel must ensure the safety of those aboard before sinking her, and the submarine made that impossible from the start. So both sides moved to unrestricted warfare, and the humanitarian obligations of the sea effectively lapsed for the duration. But here is what was on the surface of that ocean. There was no obligation on him to do any of it, and considerable risk in all of it. Yet somehow a submarine at war was steaming in daylight, on the surface, at reduced speed, with enemy survivors on her casing and lifeboats astern, under a Red Cross flag, having announced her position and her intentions to both sides in plain language. An American bomber flying from an island base found her, reported the flag and the tow, was ordered to attack, and dropped its bombs. It hit one of the lifeboats and damaged the submarine, which cast off the tow, put the survivors back into boats and dived. Someone made the decision to surface into wreckage and start taking people out of it. Someone made the decision to broadcast in clear English on a frequency the other side was listening to. Someone in a bomber saw a red cross spread across a submarine's deck, reported it, and was told to attack anyway. Someone was in a lifeboat under a tow rope when it was cast off. Then the order came. The German submarine command issued a standing instruction forbidding any attempt to rescue survivors of sunken ships, and it was read afterward as an order to kill them. The honest position is that the instruction is genuinely ambiguous and the argument about it is old. The text forbids rescue and does not order killing. Its author maintained that the reason was the Laconia attack itself, and at his trial, the charge largely failed after an American admiral confirmed that the practice of the United States submarine force in the Pacific had been substantially the same. What is not in dispute is the sequence: a rescue, an attack on it, and an order that ended rescues for the rest of the war. What makes this particularly grim is not the bombing, it is what the order did to everybody afterward. Whatever the intention behind it, the effect is documented, and it is arithmetic. After that instruction, men in the water from sunk ships were left in the water, by both sides in practice, for another 2.5 years. The truly disturbing aspect isn't this incident. It's how a rule is actually made. Nothing was negotiated, nothing was signed, and nobody convened. One captain did something unusual, one aircraft attacked it, one order was issued in response, and the customary conduct of an entire theater changed and stayed changed. Most of what is called the law of war was arrived at like this, by incident and response, and codified afterward by people describing what had already become the practice. What is currently being set that way? We have the signal logs and the order. We have no idea how many were left afterward. The position is in the middle of the South Atlantic, and there is nothing there. Number 4. Coventry. In 1974, a reader was working through a newly published book about wartime intelligence when a sentence in it accused a prime minister of allowing a city to burn. What that sentence did over the following decades would overturn everything anybody assumed about how a myth gets started. The book was the first public account of the code-breaking operation, written by a man who had served in it, and its publication was the moment the entire subject became discussable. In it he wrote that intelligence had revealed the target of a major raid in advance, that the government had known the city would be attacked, and that no warning was given and no additional defense deployed, because acting on the information would have revealed to the other side that their cipher was being read. 440 tons of high explosive and 36,000 incendiaries fell on that city in one night. 568 people were killed. The cathedral burned. For a long time, the accepted account of the code-breaking operation was that there was no account, because nothing had been published and everybody involved was bound. The book ended that, and it did so with enormous authority. The author had been there, the material was new, and there was nothing to check it against, because the archive was still closed. But here is what the archive showed when it opened. He had written from memory, 30 years afterward, without access to the files. Yet somehow, when the official history was written with the documents available, the sequence turned out to be different. The decryptions gave an operation name and a scale, and did not identify the target in time. The assessments circulating that afternoon considered London the most likely objective, and the countermeasures that were ordered on that assumption. The city was identified from radio beam intersections only in the last hours, and by then, the raid was airborne. Someone wrote a sentence from memory 30 years after the fact, in a book about material nobody else could yet see, and did not check it because there was nothing to check it against. Someone printed it, someone read it and repeated it, and it was in other people's books within a year. Then it stayed. The author never withdrew it, and died in 1990. The correction is in the official history. It is accepted by essentially every historian of the subject, and the claim continues to appear in books, articles, and documentaries, and it is one of the most frequently cited things anybody knows about that operation. What makes this particularly strange is not the error, it is where it came from. The single book that made the code-breaking operation public, written by a participant, is also the source of the most persistent false story about it, and the two traveled together, because a reader encountering the subject for the first time received both in the same paragraphs with the same authority. The truly disturbing aspect isn't this raid, it's what a first account does. The first published version of anything shapes everything afterward, not because it is best, but because it is first, and because everybody writing later has read it. and a first account written from memory by a participant is exactly the kind that carries most weight and is least checkable. The first account of any newly opened subject is written by a participant from memory because the participants are the only people who know anything, and it is the least checkable version that will ever exist and the most influential. What is currently a first account? We have the official history and the original book. We have no idea which one most people have read. The cathedral ruin is preserved beside the new one, roofless, with the walls standing and the charred cross still in it. Number 5. Foggia. In 1978, two photographic analysts were working through 30-year-old reconnaissance film for an unrelated project when a frame turned out to have people in it. What was on that film would overturn everything anybody assumed about what an archive holds. The flights had gone out from southern Italy through 1944 to photograph an industrial complex, a synthetic fuel and rubber plant that was a bombing target and was photographed repeatedly through that year. The aircraft flew straight lines at altitude, and the cameras ran continuously, which means each mission produced a strip of frames covering everything under the flight path, whether it was the target or not. 3 miles from the plant was a camp, and the camp was in the frames. There are 5 more of these, and the last one is the largest loss of life in the history of shipping. Subscribe now and stay for it. For a long time, the accepted account of what the Allies could see went like this. The question of what was known about the camps, and when, is one of the most argued in the historiography of the war, and it has been argued from documents, intercepted messages, escapee reports, diplomatic cables, and the decisions taken or not taken about bombing the railways. It is a question about intelligence and about policy, but here is what the film had on it. Nobody had been looking for the camp, and the cameras had not been aimed at it. Yet somehow, when the two analysts re-examined the original negatives with the interpretation techniques available in the 1970s, they were able to identify the camp layout, the buildings, the rail spur, and in one frame, a column of people moving along a path toward a specific building, in an image exposed by an aircraft photographing something else entirely 3 miles away. Reading it required equipment and training that did not exist in 1944. The frames had been examined at the time by interpreters looking for bomb damage at the plant, using stereoscopes and magnification appropriate to that task, and they had annotated the industrial site and moved on. Someone flew that mission at altitude over a defended target with the cameras running. Someone developed the film that night and marked up the factory, doing the job carefully and doing it correctly. Someone filed the strip in a repository where it was cataloged, stored properly, and sat for 34 years. Then it was published in 1979. The finding is careful about its own limits, and the analysts were explicit. The images do not show that anybody at the time knew what was in those frames, and there is no evidence that they were read that way in 1944. What the film establishes is that the information existed physically, in a drawer, unrecognized. What makes this particularly disturbing is not the images, it is the gap between having and knowing. The evidence was in Allied hands from the summer of 1944, on film, correctly stored and cataloged, and it was not knowledge, because nobody had the question in mind when they looked at it, and the technique to resolve it was 30 years away. Possession of a fact and awareness of it are different things, and the record does not distinguish them. The truly disturbing aspect isn't this film, it's what else is in the same condition. Every archive contains material that was collected for one purpose, examined for that purpose, and filed, and any of it may hold an answer to a question nobody was asking at the time. The information does not announce itself, and there is no procedure for finding it except somebody going back with a new question and better equipment. Every intelligence archive on the planet holds material gathered for one purpose and read once for that purpose, and the volume is such that nobody will ever go back through it with a second question. What is in the drawers? We have the negatives and a published analysis. We have no idea what else is on those strips. The film is in a national archive, and the flights were photographing a factory. Number 6. The archives. In 1982, a legal researcher was working through boxes of wartime government files for a book when a report came out of one that had been suppressed 40 years earlier. What that report said would overturn everything the United States Supreme Court had been told. The case was the exclusion of 120,000 people of Japanese descent from the West Coast, most of them American citizens, and their confinement for the duration. It had been challenged and it had been upheld in 1944 in a decision that has never been formally overturned and that turned on a single question: whether the military necessity claimed by the government was real. The government had told the court that it was, and that there had been espionage and signaling to enemy vessels from the coastal population. For a long time, the accepted account of that decision went like this: the court in wartime defers to the executive on questions of military necessity because judges are not admirals and the information is not theirs to weigh. The decision is criticized on those grounds and defended on them, and the argument has been about the proper role of a court rather than about the facts it was given. But here is what was in that box. The researcher had a permit for an archive and a question about a footnote. Yet somehow what came out of the files was a report prepared by Naval Intelligence in 1942, before the exclusion, concluding that the population posed no organized threat, that the great majority were loyal, and that the danger was from a small number of individuals who were already identified and could be dealt with individually. Alongside it were internal memoranda from government lawyers stating that the espionage claims in the brief were untrue, that the department knew they were untrue, and warning that presenting them to the court would be a suppression of evidence. The claims were presented anyway, and the passages of the brief that qualified them were removed. Someone spent months on that intelligence report and concluded there was no organized threat, and filed it. Someone read it and decided the court did not need to see it. Someone put a note in a file saying that the claims in the brief were untrue and that the department knew they were untrue, and that note stayed in that file for 40 years. Then the convictions were vacated. Petitions were brought in the early 1980s on the ground that the original judgments had been obtained by misconduct, and courts in 3 cities vacated the convictions of the men who had been prosecuted. The decision itself was never overturned on appeal and stood as precedent until the Supreme Court repudiated it in an opinion in 2018. What makes this particularly haunting is not the suppression, it is who found it. The material was in a public archive, correctly filed, available on request. It took an outsider with a specific question and 40 years, and nothing in the system that produced the documents was ever going to surface them, because an archive stores and does not read. The truly disturbing aspect isn't this case, it's what a court is. Judgment is a conclusion drawn from what a party chose to present, and the machinery for checking whether the presentation was honest sits outside the courtroom and mostly does not exist. The decision stood for 4 decades on facts the government knew were false when it stated them. A court sees what it is shown, and the only check on whether the showing was honest is an outsider going into an archive years later with a reason to look. What is currently standing on the same basis. We have the report and the memoranda. We have no idea what else was left out of that brief. The order was never rescinded during the war, and the last camp closed in 1946. Number 7. Port Chicago. In July 1944, a raiding was working a night shift, loading ammunition at a California pier, when the pier stopped existing. What followed the explosion would overturn everything the United States Navy believed about who it was asking to do that work. 2 ships were alongside, taking bombs, shells, and depth charges out of rail cars and into the holds. At around 10 at night, the cargo went up. The blast was recorded on seismographs. It destroyed both ships and the pier, and it killed 320 men outright. 202 of them were black enlisted sailors, which was roughly 2/3 of the dead, and it was the largest single loss of black servicemen in that war. For a long time, the accepted account of a disaster like this was that it was an accident of a dangerous job. Loading ammunition is hazardous, wartime pressure raises risk, and an explosion in a munitions port is a category of thing that happens. The Board of Inquiry was convened on those terms and reached that conclusion. But here is what the work at that pier actually was. The men doing it had no training in handling ammunition of any kind. Yet somehow the loading divisions at that base were composed entirely of black enlisted men, commanded entirely by white officers. None of the enlisted men had been given ordnance training. The officers were reported to have run informal competitions between divisions on tonnage loaded per shift, and safety procedures published by the Coast Guard were not being followed. The Board of Inquiry found the cause undetermined and recorded no fault. Someone assigned men with no ordnance training to load live bombs and depth charges at night. Someone ran a competition between divisions on tonnage moved per shift and let the men know the standings. Someone sat on a review board and wrote, "Undetermined." Then the survivors were ordered back. 3 weeks later, the same men were told to resume loading at another pier, under the same officers, with no change in training or procedure. 258 refused. Most accepted punishment when threatened. 50 were charged with mutiny, tried together in a hearing lasting 6 weeks, convicted, and sentenced to between 8 and 15 years. The convictions were criticized at the time, including by the lawyer who observed the trial for a civil rights organization. Sentences were commuted after the war, and the men were released, but the convictions stood. Someone stood on a pier and said no. Someone tried 50 men at once. Someone signed the sentences. Then it took 80 years. Reviews were sought repeatedly across decades and were refused or granted only in part. In July 2024, the Secretary of the Navy set aside the convictions of all 256 men, finding that the trials had been fundamentally unfair and that racial discrimination had shaped both the assignment of the work and the prosecution. Every one of them was dead. What makes this particularly bleak is not the explosion, it is the interval. The facts were not in dispute in 1944, and they are not in dispute now. What changed between the trial and the exoneration is not the evidence, but the willingness of the institution to look at it, and that took the lifetime of everybody involved. The truly disturbing aspect isn't this pier, it's what an exoneration establishes. It corrects a record and returns nothing, and it happens when the correction has become cheap, which is generally after the people it concerns are beyond being helped by it. Institutions correct themselves at the point where correcting costs nothing, and that point arrives at a predictable interval, which is roughly the lifetime of everybody who would have benefited. What is waiting for that? We have a board of inquiry and an order signed 80 years later. We have no idea how many similar records exist. The site is a naval weapons station, and there is a memorial on it. Number 8. The safe. In 1992, a state commission was auditing a presidential archive in Moscow when an envelope came out of a safe containing a document the government had denied existed for 50 years. What was inside it would overturn everything half of Europe had been told about how the war began. The document is a map with a line drawn on it and a text attached. It is a secret protocol to a treaty of non-aggression signed in August 1939 between Germany and the Soviet Union, and it divides the territory between them into spheres of influence, the Baltic states, Finland, and a partition line through Poland. 9 days after it was signed, Germany invaded Poland from the west. 16 days after that, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, and the two forces met on the line the protocol had drawn. For a long time, the accepted account inside the Soviet Union, and in every state within its system, went like this. The treaty was a non-aggression pact and nothing more, forced on the Soviet Union by the failure of the Western powers to form an alliance against Germany. The secret protocols were a Western fabrication, produced from captured German microfilm and published in 1948 as propaganda, and no such documents existed in Soviet possession. That position was official, it was taught, and it was maintained at every level of the state for half a century. But here is what the West had been publishing since 1948. The German originals had been destroyed in the war, and the copies were photographic. Yet somehow the microfilm published in the West matched, line for line, a document that was at that moment sitting in a sealed envelope in the archive of the Soviet leadership, correctly filed, catalogued, and passed from one general secretary to the next with the instruction that it was not to be opened. Someone typed that protocol in 1939, and somebody drew the line on the map. Someone put it in an envelope, sealed it, and wrote on the outside who was permitted to open it. Someone in every subsequent decade opened the safe, saw the envelope, and closed the safe again. Then the position changed. In 1989, a commission of the Soviet Parliament, under a member of the leadership, reported that the protocols had existed and were valid, and the Parliament voted to condemn them, and it did so without the original document, on the basis of the copies and of testimony. The original was produced 3 years later, after the state had ceased to exist. The honest position is that the denial was not universally believed even inside the system, that historians in several of the affected countries had worked on the assumption the protocols were real for decades, and that the practical political effect of the admission was enormous in the Baltic states and comparatively small elsewhere. What is not in dispute is that the document was in the archive throughout. What makes this particularly mysterious is not the lie, it is that they kept it. Every leader who inherited that envelope had the option of destroying it, and none of them did, in a system that destroyed a great deal of paper, and the reason is not recorded anywhere. It was preserved, deliberately, by the people with the strongest interest in it not existing. The truly disturbing aspect isn't this envelope, it's what archives do to states. An institution built to keep things keeps them regardless of whether the state wants them kept, because destroying a document requires somebody to decide and sign, and leaving it closed requires nobody to do anything at all. Inaction preserves. The same asymmetry runs through every record system ever built, which is why the incriminating document is usually still there and usually still closed. What is currently being preserved by nobody doing anything. We have the protocol and the map. We have no idea what else is in that archive. The line on the map runs through what is now 3 countries. Number 9. Huntsville. In 1982, an investigator in a small federal office was checking a personnel file from an immigration program when the dates in it stopped lining up with the man's own account. What was missing from that file would overturn everything the United States space program believed about its own founding. The file belonged to a rocket engineer. He had come to the country in the late 1940s under a program that brought German scientists and their families over, had worked on missiles for the Army, and had then run the development of the launch vehicle that carried the moon landings, retiring with the highest civilian award the space agency gives. His security file described his wartime work as technical direction of rocket production. For a long time, the accepted account of that program went like this. The war ended, the German rocket engineers were brought over, and the United States acquired the technical basis of its missile and space effort. The men are described as scientists, the transfer is described as a recruitment, and the histories of the space program, written from the 1960s onward, treat their wartime work as a technical career interrupted by politics. But here is what the production actually was. The program that brought him over had been instructed to exclude anyone who had been a committed party member or involved in war crimes. Yet somehow the files assembled for that program were, in a number of cases, revised. Derogatory material was removed or reworded, memberships were minimized, and the men were cleared, because the alternative was that they would go to the Soviet Union instead, and the decision was made at a level where that consideration outweighed the other one. In this case, the file did not record what the production site was. The rockets were assembled in a tunnel complex driven into a hillside, using labor from a concentration camp, under conditions in which the death rate among the workers exceeded the number of people killed by the weapon itself. He had been the operations director. The investigation established from wartime documents that he had participated in requesting and allocating that labor and had been present at the site throughout. Someone at a desk in 1947 read a security assessment, decided what could not be left in it, and rewrote it. Someone signed the clearance underneath. Someone put a distinguished service medal round a man's neck in 1969 on a stage in Florida. Then he left. In 1984, facing proceedings to strip his citizenship, he renounced it voluntarily and returned to West Germany, where he was investigated and not charged. He maintained that he had had no authority over the labor and no ability to change the conditions. His departure was reported briefly, and the space agency did not revise its published histories. The honest position is that the moral picture is not simple, and the case for prosecution was never tested in court. He was one of thousands in that program, most of whom were engineers rather than officials, and the argument about individual responsibility inside a system of that kind is the same argument that runs through the whole post-war period. What is not in dispute is what the file omitted. What makes this particularly disturbing is not the man. It is the arithmetic somebody did. The decision to clean those files was taken deliberately, at policy level, by people who knew what they were setting aside, on the calculation that the technical capability was worth more than the record. That calculation was probably correct in its own terms, and it was made in the full knowledge of what it cost. The truly disturbing aspect isn't this program, it's what a founding history is. The account of how a country got to the moon was written from files that had been edited before anybody was looking, and the editing was not a cover-up by the people in the histories, but a policy decision made years earlier by people who do not appear in them at all. Every national history rests on files, and files are assembled by somebody with a purpose before any historian sees them, which means the editorial decisions that matter most are taken by people who never appear in the account. What else was decided before the writing started? We have the wartime documents and the amended file. We have no idea what the originals said. The tunnels are open to visitors now, and the launch vehicle stands on its side in a museum in Alabama. Number 10. The Baltic. In January 1945, a radio operator was tracking shipping in the Baltic when the largest loss of life in the history of the sea went unreported by anybody. What went down that night would overturn everything anybody assumes about whose deaths a timeline contains. The ship was a former cruise liner, requisitioned and used as a barracks, sailing from a port in East Prussia as the Eastern Front closed on it. She was carrying refugees. The loading was chaotic, and the manifest was abandoned partway through. The best reconstruction puts more than 10,000 people aboard a ship built for around 2,000, of whom something over 4,000 were children. She sailed in freezing weather, was struck by 3 torpedoes from a Soviet submarine, and sank in under an hour into water at around 4 degrees. Roughly 9,400 people died. It is the largest loss of life in a single ship sinking that has ever occurred, and it is around 6 times the loss on the Titanic. For a long time, the accepted account of maritime disaster went like this. The great losses are known by name. They have books, films, inquiries, and memorials, and the list is short enough to recite, and any disaster of the first rank is on it. But here is what the list leaves out. The sinking was legally ambiguous, rather than clearly criminal, because the ship carried military personnel and anti-aircraft guns, as well as refugees, which arguably made her a legitimate target under the rules as they stood. Yet somehow the largest maritime disaster in recorded history is absent from that list almost entirely. It was not reported by the German authorities at the time because the collapse of the Eastern Front was not being reported. It was not reported by the Soviet side because the submarine commander was not treated as a hero for it until much later. And it was not taken up in the West afterward because the dead were Germans and the war they were fleeing was one their country had started. Someone issued boarding passes to families at the quayside and then stopped issuing them and let people on anyway because the alternative was leaving them on the ice. Someone counted to a number and then stopped counting. Someone in a submarine fired 3 torpedoes at a darkened ship running without lights in a war zone and had no way of knowing what was in it and did not find out for years. Then it was not discussed. Serious public discussion in Germany was largely deferred for half a century, out of a widely shared and deliberate position that the losses of the people who had begun the war were not the losses that should be spoken about first, and the subject was reopened in the 1990s and 2000s with considerable care about exactly that. The honest position is that the reticence was not an accident or a suppression, it was a choice, made for reasons that were understood at the time, and the argument about whether it was the right one is a live argument inside that country and is not settled. What is not in dispute is the number. What makes this particularly grim is not the sinking, it is the arithmetic of who gets counted. Nothing was hidden, and no document was closed. The event is simply not in the list, and the reason it is not in the list is that lists are made by people, in countries, for purposes, and this one belonged to nobody who was making lists. The truly disturbing aspect isn't this ship. It's what an official timeline is made of. Every event on this list was in a document the whole time, a manifest, a signal log, a security file, an envelope in a safe, a strip of film, a report in a box. None of them was hidden, and all of them were missing, because a record is not a timeline. A timeline is what somebody assembled from a record for a reason, in a language, at a moment, about the people they were counting. What is in the documents nobody has assembled? We have a reconstructed passenger estimate. We have no idea how many were aboard. The wreck lies in about 40 meters of water off the Polish coast, designated a war grave, and it is dived illegally. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.